When I saw the bus ticket still tucked into the pocket of my coat, my heart skipped, not because I had planned to leave, but because I almost had. That small rectangle of paper was proof of a decision I didn't make, a line I almost crossed, and the story that led me there. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out, the faded ink smudged from the rain that day, and memories hit me like a wave I couldn't stop. The sound of his voice, the smell of sea air, the way my chest ached with both guilt and something dangerously close to hope. My husband had asked me earlier, so casually, where I'd gone that afternoon, and I had lied. I lied smoothly, as if lying was something I had always done. I told him I had been running errands. I told him nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Because 3 months ago, a moment, small, almost insignificant, cracked something deep inside me, and from that crack, everything started slipping. Before I explain how I ended up holding that bus ticket and making choices I once thought unthinkable, let me take you back to where it all began, to the day when my quiet life shifted, quietly, but irreversibly. The mornings in our house had become a quiet ritual, a routine that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow to me. My husband always left early, his footsteps down the hallway steady and familiar, the soft sound of the front door closing marking the start of another day that blurred into the next. I'd lie in bed for a few minutes after he left, listening to the silence settle like dust over the rooms, and I'd wonder when that silence stopped being comforting and started feeling heavy. That morning, I lingered longer than usual. The light coming through the curtains felt pale, tired, like me. I walked to the kitchen, bare feet against the cool tile, and found the coffee pot still half full, the remnants of his breakfast on the counter. He always left it that way, small evidence of his presence, but even those signs felt distant, like postcards from a place I no longer visited. I sat at the table, staring at the mug in my hands, and tried to remember the last time I felt truly seen by him. Not just glanced at, not just acknowledged, really seen. The answer didn't come easily. By late morning, the air in the house felt stale. I opened the back door to let in fresh air, only to hear the rusty squeak of the garden gate swinging loosely again. That gate had been broken for months, and every time it clanged in the wind, it felt like a reminder of things we kept meaning to fix but never did. I'd mentioned it to my husband more than once. He'd always nod, say he'd get around to it, and then the subject would vanish like smoke. So, when the handyman arrived, the one my neighbor recommended, it felt almost like a disruption in the static of my days. He looked too young for the job, at first glance. His truck was old but clean, his hands already marked with the kind of small cuts and scrapes that come from working with them. He had the kind of easy smile you don't expect from someone you've never met, the kind that makes you wonder if he smiles like that at everyone, or if you're imagining something personal in it. He introduced himself simply, with a voice that held no hurry. "I heard about the gate," he said, and I nodded, suddenly aware of how messy my hair was, how plain my clothes felt. I led him through the kitchen, down to the garden, the smell of coffee still clinging to the air. I don't know why, but I found myself apologizing for the state of the yard, as if the weeds between the stones were a reflection of me. He only shrugged and said it was nothing he hadn't seen before. There was nothing extraordinary about the way he worked, and yet, I found myself watching. The way he moved felt effortless, the way he crouched near the hinges, the way the sunlight caught the back of his neck. It had been years since I'd noticed someone in that way, and the realization startled me. I busied myself in the kitchen, pretending to check emails on my phone, pretending not to look out the window every few minutes. But I did. I caught myself thinking about how quiet the house usually was, and how different it felt with someone else moving through it, even for just a morning. When he came back in to wash his hands, the smell of metal and wood followed him, and it struck me how different it was from the familiar scent of my husband's cologne. Not better, not worse, just different. He stood at the sink, rinsing his hands, and we made small talk. Where he was from, how long he'd been working. ordinary conversation. But it didn't feel ordinary. He laughed once at something I said, though I can't even remember what it was, and it felt like a sound I hadn't heard in the house for too long. I realized then how empty my days had become, how little space there was for something as simple as laughter. By the time he finished, the gate no longer squeaked, no longer clanged. He wiped his hands on a rag, thanked me for the tea I'd offered, and walked back toward his truck. I stood in the doorway, holding a dish towel, and watched him go. It was nothing. It should have been nothing. But as the sound of his truck faded, I looked around the house, at the untouched mug, at the quiet walls, at the familiar shadows, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift. Not loud, not obvious. Just a crack, small enough to ignore. But I didn't ignore it. The next morning, the gate didn't squeak. It closed with a quiet, confident click that felt strange after so many months of that rattling clang. When I stepped out into the garden, I caught myself listening for the old sound, almost missing it, and then I realized that maybe it wasn't the gate I missed, it was the distraction it had given me, the excuse to complain, the tiny crack of imperfection I could point to. I made coffee as usual, the smell filling the kitchen, and I watched the steam curl above the mug while I sat at the table. My phone was face down next to me. It didn't buzz, of course, there was no reason for it to, but I kept glancing at it anyway. By late morning, I found myself walking past the repaired gate again, touching it lightly, as if to prove to myself that it was real. My neighbor waved from across the street, calling out something about how lucky I was to have found that young man so quickly. Her tone was casual, but the words stuck. That young man. It sounded strange, almost improper, even though nothing had happened. I tried to fill the day with tasks, laundry, organizing the pantry, sorting old papers, but none of it settled the strange restlessness I felt. By mid-afternoon, I noticed something odd. I was thinking about what I would wear the next day. Not because I had plans, but because suddenly it felt like I might. The following day, he came back. It wasn't planned, not for me anyway. He knocked on the back door, holding a small canvas bag of tools, and said the words that sent my heart skittering, "I forgot something the other day." I stood there, holding the dish towel from the morning dishes, and stared for a second too long. He gestured toward the garage, where he'd left one of his tools behind. I nodded, stepping aside, and tried to make my voice sound casual when I said, "Of course, come in." The air felt different with him there again. Maybe it was my imagination, but even the kitchen seemed brighter. He walked through to the garage, and I followed, though I could have stayed behind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and old wood. He rummaged for the tool he'd left, and I stood leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely, pretending to watch casually but feeling anything but casual. When he found the missing wrench, he turned toward me with that same easy smile. "Didn't mean to bother you again," he said. I shook my head, the words leaving my mouth before I thought about them. "It's no bother." That should have been it. He had his wrench. He could have left. But he didn't, not immediately. He lingered, asking how the gate was holding up, running his hand along the frame as if checking his own work. I found myself saying more than I needed to about the garden, about the flowers I had been meaning to plant, even about the weather, though we both could see the clear sky through the window. He laughed once, softly, and it felt like something unlocked inside me. And then, without thinking, without planning, without any script for what I was doing, I stepped closer. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no grand declarations, no warnings. One moment we were standing a few feet apart, and the next we weren't. The wrench was still in his hand, my dish towel still in mine. And then, quietly, simply, **** we kissed ***. I felt it more than I expected. It wasn't fireworks or a movie scene. It was warmth, closeness, and the startling awareness that my heart was beating faster than it had in years. When it ended, there was no awkward laughter, no nervous explanation. He just looked at me for a second, as if searching for words, and then he nodded slightly, as though acknowledging something we both now knew. He left soon after, wrench in hand, the click of the gate sounding different this time. I stood in the garage for a long moment after he was gone, the smell of oil and metal sharp in the air. My hands felt empty. My mind felt louder than the quiet house. I went back inside, closed the door, and sat at the kitchen table again. The mug from that morning was still there, coffee cold and untouched. I stared at it, at the ring it had left on the table, and I realized that nothing in my life had changed, and yet, somehow, everything had. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to go through my usual routine of making dinner, setting the table, listening to my husband talk about his day, but it felt like I was acting out a role in a play I'd been performing for years. My hands moved on their own, chopping vegetables, stirring soup, arranging plates, but my mind kept circling back to the moment in the garage. It wasn't guilt that hit me first, it was confusion. The kind that sits heavy in your stomach and makes everything else blurry. I kept asking myself, why did that happen? I had no intention of letting it. I hadn't thought about it before. And yet, it happened, and the feeling of it lingered in a way I couldn't quite shake. At dinner, my husband noticed I was quieter than usual. He asked if I felt tired, and I smiled too quickly, saying, just a long day. He nodded, accepting the explanation, and went back to eating. He didn't see the storm in my head. Or maybe he did, and he chose not to ask more. After he went to bed, I sat in the living room, the television on for noise, though I couldn't tell you what show was playing. The remote sat untouched on the table as I scrolled through my phone instead. I wasn't looking for anything, but somehow I ended up searching his name. The young man who had fixed my gate, who had kissed me without warning. It wasn't hard to find him, he wasn't hiding. A few pictures, a small profile. One of him in a workshop, sleeves rolled up, his hair a little messy. Another of an old motorcycle he was clearly proud of. I studied those photos longer than I should have, and I hated myself a little for it. But there was something about them, the simplicity of his life, the unpolished way he showed himself to the world, that pulled at me. It was late when I finally put the phone down. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat there in the dark, listening to that ticking, and wondered how I had arrived here, in this moment, feeling like I had crossed a line I never even saw coming. The next day didn't feel like any other day. I woke up before my husband's alarm, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail in my head. It wasn't just the kiss itself, it was everything it represented. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. That people make mistakes, that small things can happen and be left behind. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't just a mistake. It had cracked something open inside me. I noticed it in the smallest moments. When I poured coffee, I thought about the sound of his voice. When I opened the back door, I noticed the quiet click of the repaired gate, and it felt like his presence was still there somehow, even though he wasn't. My husband kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work that morning, a routine gesture, but it felt almost foreign now. Not wrong, not unwanted, just unfamiliar, as if the meaning of even that small touch had shifted overnight. By midday, I realized I hadn't done anything I'd planned to do. The laundry basket sat untouched. The list of errands I had written the day before was still pinned to the fridge. I just moved from room to room, restless, picking up objects only to set them down again. And I thought about him. About how, when he stood in my kitchen, the house didn't feel so still. About how his laugh cut through the silence in a way I hadn't realized I missed. I didn't see him that day. Or the day after. But the absence felt heavier than I expected. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling while he slept. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight through the blinds. My mind wouldn't quiet. It wasn't just about that single moment anymore. It was about me, about who I had become without even realizing it. About how my days had become a blur of sameness, how I had stopped asking for more because I didn't even know what more meant anymore. I thought about the years that had passed, about the way we'd built a life that was stable and safe, but maybe too safe. Somewhere along the way, the edges of who I was had worn down until I didn't even notice their absence. And now, one unexpected moment had shaken all of that. Lying there in the dark, I asked myself the question I had been avoiding since that kiss: was this the start of something, or the beginning of the end of something else? The answer didn't come. I only knew one thing: I couldn't go back to not feeling what I had felt. The day he returned for the forgotten tool kept replaying in my mind, looping like a song I couldn't stop humming under my breath. But now, it wasn't just the memory of what had happened that weighed on me, it was the uncertainty of what it meant. I didn't know if it was an ending or a beginning, or if I even wanted to find out. The morning after my long, restless night, the house felt different. I couldn't quite place why, but it was there, a heaviness in the air, as if the walls themselves had caught on to the shift in me. My husband moved through his routine the way he always did, pouring coffee, picking up his briefcase, leaving with the same soft "I'll be home by 6." But when the door closed behind him, I realized how aware I'd become of that silence that followed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt loaded. I tried to shake it off by staying busy. I made lists, crossed things off, wiped counters that were already clean. But nothing seemed to clear my head. And that's when my phone buzzed. It wasn't him, not at first. It was an email, a reminder about an appointment. But just seeing my phone light up jolted me. I found myself wishing it had been him. And then, almost immediately, hating myself for wishing that. By midday, I'd stopped pretending to focus on chores. I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee long gone cold, and stared at the repaired gate through the window. The gate didn't squeak anymore. It closed perfectly, smoothly. The job was done. There was no reason for him to come back. That thought made something in my chest tighten. Then, as if summoned by that thought, my phone buzzed again. A message. Short. Almost too casual. I think I left another tool behind. Would it be okay if I stopped by later? I stared at the screen, my pulse jumping, and told myself there was nothing strange about the question. People forget things. They come back for them. That's all this was. But even as I told myself that, I stood up and went to my bedroom to change. I spent far too long choosing something that looked casual but not careless. Something that didn't scream effort, but didn't scream indifference either. I laughed at myself in the mirror for how ridiculous it was, and yet I didn't change back. When he knocked later that afternoon, I felt that strange lurch in my stomach again. He stood there holding his empty canvas bag, and for a moment, I thought about what he saw when he looked at me. Did he see the lines at the corners of my eyes? Did he see the way I smoothed my sweater, as if I could erase every wrinkle of age? "Come in," I said, and I heard how steady my voice sounded, even though my thoughts weren't steady at all. He stepped inside, his boots leaving faint marks on the mat, and we walked to the garage together. He found the tool almost immediately, a pair of pliers tucked behind an old box of gardening gloves. There was no reason for him to linger. But he did. He asked about the gate again, running his hand along the frame as though testing its strength, and I found myself talking about things that had nothing to do with the gate. The weather. A new cafe I'd heard about but hadn't visited. How the garden was overdue for planting. He listened, leaning slightly against the doorframe, and it was such a simple thing, just listening, but it felt like more than I'd had in a long time. There was a pause in the conversation. Not awkward. Just quiet. He looked at me, his expression open, unreadable. And I stood there, holding on to the edge of a cardboard box as though it could anchor me. That's when I realized how far I'd already gone without meaning to. I hadn't planned for him to come back. I hadn't planned for the kiss the last time he was here. But now, standing here again, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop whatever this was turning into. He didn't move closer. Neither did I. But the space between us felt like it shifted all on its own, tightening, like the air itself had a pulse. Finally, he nodded toward the pliers in his hand and said, almost lightly, "Guess I should get out of your way." I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. All I managed was a quiet thank you. He left, the sound of the gate closing behind him again, soft, final, but not final enough. I stayed in the garage long after he was gone, running my fingers over the box he had brushed against, staring at the spot where he'd stood. It felt absurd, but I couldn't deny it. Back inside, I poured myself another cup of coffee I didn't drink. The house was quiet again, but the silence wasn't the same as before. Because now, I wasn't just listening to the quiet. I was listening for the next knock on the door. The day after he left with the pliers, I told myself that I would get a grip on things. I woke up early, made coffee, and forced myself through my routine like I was following a script. Breakfast dishes were washed and stacked neatly, laundry was folded, and the vacuum cleaner hummed its way across the carpet, but none of it drowned out the thoughts circling in my head. No matter how much I busied my hands, my mind kept wandering back to that look he gave me in the garage, the one I couldn't quite name but couldn't forget either. I didn't see him that day. Or the next. And in some ways, that was harder. His absence was louder than his presence. Every time the gate clicked softly in the breeze, I caught myself glancing toward the window, expecting him. Each time a car slowed down outside, I thought it might be him stopping again, maybe for another forgotten tool, maybe with some casual excuse that wasn't really an excuse at all. By the end of that week, I found myself restless in a way I hadn't been in years. I took longer walks, wandering through the town, hoping the movement would clear my head. But instead of quieting the storm inside me, those walks only made me more aware of how different my life felt now. Every corner of town felt familiar, unchanged, and yet, I was changing. That's when it happened. I saw him. Not at my house. Not at the gate. Not standing in my kitchen with a wrench in hand. But in town, in the most ordinary place imaginable, the grocery store parking lot. I had almost convinced myself that the entire thing, the kiss, the second visit, even the awkward, lingering silences, had been something small, something I could box up and put away. But when I saw him, just standing there in the sun with a bag of groceries in one hand and his phone in the other, that little box inside me split wide open again. He noticed me first. He smiled like it was the easiest thing in the world, like nothing about this was complicated. I told myself I would keep walking, that I'd just wave and keep going, but my feet didn't listen. Instead, I found myself stopping, returning his smile, and before I knew it, we were standing in front of each other, the sound of cars and chatter fading somewhere behind us. We spoke like two people who had just run into an old friend, light, casual. But every word felt loaded, as if there were things neither of us could say out loud. He asked if I was busy, and I said, not really, even though I had errands waiting. That's how I ended up sitting across from him at a small cafe nearby. The table was tiny, the kind you could barely fit 2 cups of coffee on, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted beans. The whole thing felt harmless. People have coffee. People talk. But the way he leaned in slightly when he spoke, the way I caught myself studying his hands when he stirred his cup, it didn't feel harmless. We talked about nothing and everything, how the town was changing, how the weather felt like it might turn, even silly things like which cafe had the best bread rolls. And yet, underneath those words, there was a tension neither of us named. I watched the rain start outside, droplets streaking the cafe window. It was light at first, then heavier, the kind of rain that makes you forget what time it is. I should have left then. I knew it. But instead, I stayed. We sat there as the rain blurred the view outside, as the sky dimmed into a soft gray. And then it happened, not loud, not dramatic. We kissed. Just those two words, but everything they carried hit me all at once. It wasn't impulsive this time, not the way it had been in the garage. This time, it felt inevitable. Like the space between us had been shrinking since the moment we saw each other in the parking lot, and this was where it led. When it was over, we didn't speak. Not about it, anyway. He paid for the coffee, we stepped out into the rain, and he walked me to my car. I drove home in silence, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm as I tried to breathe, tried to think, tried to understand what had just happened. The house was dark when I got back, the kind of early evening darkness that settles in too fast when clouds hide the sunset. My husband wasn't home yet. The quiet should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It felt like a spotlight, like the walls were waiting for me to confess something I didn't have the words for. I set my bag on the counter, took off my coat, and stared at my reflection in the hallway mirror. My hair was damp from the rain. My lips still tingled from the kiss. And for the first time, I couldn't tell if what I felt was guilt, or the terrifying realization that I didn't feel enough of it. The next morning felt heavier than the rain that had soaked me the night before. I woke before the alarm, staring at the ceiling, my body stiff with the weight of thoughts I couldn't push aside. The house was quiet, but the quiet wasn't restful. It was the kind of stillness that made me hear every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator, every echo of my own heartbeat. I lay there for a long time, not moving, just thinking about what I'd done. About what we'd done. The kiss in the cafe hadn't been an accident, not like the first one in the garage. It had been a choice, even if I couldn't admit it out loud yet. And that terrified me in a way I didn't expect. My husband stirred beside me, his breathing deep, steady, unaware. He turned slightly in his sleep, his hand brushing against my arm. It was a small gesture, unconscious, but it made my chest ache. He didn't know anything. He trusted me completely. That trust sat on me like a weight I couldn't shift. I got out of bed quietly, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and made my way to the kitchen. The routine played out almost automatically, coffee brewing, toast popping, the hum of the kettle, but none of it felt grounding. It felt like I was going through motions to disguise the chaos inside. The hours passed slowly. I folded laundry, reorganized the pantry, even scrubbed the counters though they didn't need it. But no matter how many tasks I forced myself through, my thoughts kept circling back to him, his smile in that cafe, the way the rain streaked across the window behind him, the way it felt when his hand brushed mine before that kiss. By afternoon, the weight of it became unbearable. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, and for the first time, I decided to do something I had been resisting. I wrote him a message. It wasn't long, just a few sentences. I think we've gone too far. This can't happen again. It's wrong. I stared at the screen before pressing send, my finger hovering over the button like a trigger. And then I tapped it. The message whooshed away, and the silence that followed felt deafening. Minutes passed, each one longer than the last, until my phone buzzed. His reply was shorter than mine. I understand. Just that. 2 words. And for some reason, that made my stomach twist more than any argument, more than any plea would have. I understand. It was so final, so quiet, and yet it didn't feel like closure. It felt like a door left slightly open, even as it appeared shut. I placed my phone face down on the table and sat there, listening to the clock tick on the wall. The hands moved, but time felt suspended, like I was trapped in that moment of waiting. The rest of the day passed in fragments. My husband called to say he'd be late, something about a meeting running over. I nodded as I listened, even though he couldn't see me, answering with a steady voice that didn't match the storm in my chest. When evening came, I cooked dinner, though I barely tasted it. I smiled when he walked through the door, the same smile I'd worn for years, but it felt strained, hollow. That night, when I lay down beside him, my body felt tense. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, my mind replaying everything. The first kiss in the garage, the second in the cafe, the rain streaking across the glass, the way I told him it couldn't happen again, and the quiet way he said, "I understand." But I didn't feel understood. I felt like I was standing in the middle of two lives, neither one fully mine. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the darkness didn't bring peace. It only made the questions louder. And beneath all of it, there was one thought I couldn't silence. I had told him it was over. But deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted it to be. The morning after I sent that message and received his quiet reply, I woke to a gray sky and the kind of heavy silence that felt like it was pressing on my skin. I stayed in bed for a while, my eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling paint, my mind restless and unsettled. I had told him it was over, and he had said he understood. It should have been simple. It should have been done. But it didn't feel done. The day dragged, each hour stretching into the next. I tried to fill the time with tasks, wiping the counters twice, refolding laundry that didn't need it, organizing the spice cabinet until the jars were lined up in perfect rows, but nothing quieted my thoughts. The more I tried to shut the door in my mind, the wider it seemed to swing open. By the afternoon, I couldn't stand the walls of the house anymore. I needed air. I grabbed my coat, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked. At first, I thought I'd just circle the block, maybe stop by the bakery, maybe pick up a few things from the market. But my feet had their own plans. I ended up at the bus stop. I didn't even remember deciding to go there. I just found myself standing on the cracked pavement, looking at the faded timetable taped to the sign. The next bus came in 15 minutes. And it was headed toward the coast. I don't know what I told myself in that moment, something about clearing my head, something about the sea air. But I got on that bus. The ride was quiet, the seats half empty, the windows streaked with the remnants of rain from earlier. The town slipped away slowly, replaced by open roads and scattered fields, and eventually, the distant shimmer of the sea. When I got off, the air smelled different, briny, sharp, alive. I walked toward the sound of waves without really thinking, my coat pulled tight around me. That's when my phone buzzed. A message. Not long, not detailed. Just a picture of a weathered pier, the wood sun-bleached and splintered, stretching out into the gray-green water. And a single word underneath it. Here. I stood there for a long moment, my heart thudding, staring at that photo like it held some kind of answer. And then I started walking. The pier was almost empty when I reached it, just a couple of fishermen at the far end, their lines slack in the slow-moving tide. He was leaning against one of the old wooden posts, his bag on the ground beside him, his eyes on the water. When he saw me, he didn't look surprised. As if he'd known I would come. I didn't know what to say. I don't think he did either. But we didn't need to, not at first. We walked along the shore, the wet sand clinging to our shoes, the wind pulling at my hair. The sky was low, the kind of gray that blurs the horizon until you can't tell where the water ends and the clouds begin. We didn't talk about the message I sent. We didn't talk about what we'd said, or what we hadn't said. We talked about nothing, and yet somehow, that silence between words spoke louder than anything. As the afternoon slipped into evening, the air grew cooler, the light softer, and we ended up back at the pier, sitting on the edge, our legs dangling over the water. There was a moment, a quiet, inevitable moment, when the space between us simply disappeared. We spent the night together. No words could have undone what happened, and no words were spoken to try. When morning came, the sky was streaked with pale light, and the sea looked almost gentle. I stood there for a long time, the smell of salt and damp wood heavy in the air, the chill biting through my coat. Something had shifted, though I couldn't name it. I only knew that whatever line I thought I was balancing on had long since been crossed. And there was no going back to the person I had been before. Morning came with a pale, unforgiving light. I woke to the sound of gulls overhead and the muted crash of waves in the distance. The smell of salt still clung to my hair, my clothes, my skin. I sat up slowly, the air cool against my face, and for a moment I didn't know where I was, not because I'd forgotten, but because part of me didn't want to remember. The pier was nearly empty now, only a couple of fishermen setting up their lines, their quiet voices carried away by the wind. He was still there beside me, still asleep, his head tilted slightly, his jacket pulled up against the chill. He looked so young in that moment, so completely untroubled, and that sight struck me with something sharp, because I wasn't untroubled. I stood, careful not to wake him, and stepped a few paces away to the edge of the pier. The wood creaked beneath my feet, weathered and worn. I stared out at the sea, its surface rippling under the weak morning sun, and a strange heaviness settled over me. What had happened the night before felt too big, too final to ignore. There was no going back, and yet, standing there in the gray light of dawn, I wished for the impossible, to rewind, to undo, to step back to the moment before anything started. I didn't wake him when I left. I walked back through the narrow streets toward the bus stop, my coat pulled tight, my shoes leaving damp prints on the pavement. I caught the next bus home, and as the coastline disappeared behind me, I felt like I was leaving part of myself there, something I couldn't name and couldn't retrieve. By the time I reached home, the world had shifted back to ordinary. The familiar streets, the trimmed hedges, the neighbors' cars parked in their usual spots, it all looked the same, and yet nothing felt the same. My husband's suitcase was in the hallway. It was the first thing I saw when I opened the door. His suitcase, zipped, standing upright like a silent sentinel. He had come home early. My breath caught, and I just stood there for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob. "Hey," he called from the kitchen, his voice casual, unaware. "You're back." I forced my voice to sound steady when I answered, "Yeah, just went out for some air." I walked into the kitchen, my coat still damp, and saw him standing there, pouring coffee like he always did. There was nothing unusual in the way he moved, nothing suspicious in his eyes. He didn't know. He asked where I had been, and I heard myself lie without thinking. "I went for a long walk," I said. "Needed to clear my head." He nodded, accepting the answer easily. Too easily. And that made the guilt twist sharper in my chest. The rest of the day moved in strange fragments. I unpacked groceries I hadn't bought just to look busy. I washed a load of laundry that didn't need washing. I cooked dinner even though neither of us was hungry. My husband talked about his trip, the meetings he'd had, the people he'd seen. I nodded in the right places, murmured agreement when needed, but my mind wasn't with him. It was still back there, on the pier, in the salt air, in the quiet weight of what had happened. That night, after he went to bed, I stood alone in the hallway, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized myself. My hair was tangled from the sea wind, my skin pale under the dim light, my eyes darker than I remembered. I thought about what I had done. Not just the night before, but all of it, the moments that led there, the small choices, the looks, the silences. I thought about my husband asleep in the next room, about the trust in his voice when he said, "You're back," and how I had lied to him without hesitation. The guilt was there, but it wasn't simple. Because alongside it, something else lingered. Something I couldn't name. Something that scared me more than the guilt itself. The days that followed blurred into one another, a haze of half-finished thoughts and restless movement. I went through the motions of life, but everything felt muted, as if someone had turned the volume down on the world. My husband's voice at the breakfast table, the sound of cars passing outside, even the smell of coffee in the kitchen, they all felt distant, muffled, as though I were watching myself from the outside. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened by the pier, but it wasn't just about the night itself, it was about everything that had led me there. The first conversation, the first look that lasted a beat too long, the first kiss I hadn't expected. Each step felt so small at the time, and yet, looking back, I could see how they had all been leading to that single point. The guilt sat on me, but not in the way I had expected. It didn't crush me. It didn't drown me. It just weighed, a steady, unrelenting reminder that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And yet, what frightened me most was the realization that the guilt wasn't enough to erase what I felt underneath it, something like longing, or maybe defiance, or maybe just the awareness that there was a version of me I hadn't seen in years, and she had woken up. I told myself I could go back to how things were. That I could patch the cracks, sweep up the fragments, pretend that the pieces had never shifted. But every time I tried, it felt hollow, like rehearsing lines to a play I no longer wanted to be in. It all came to a breaking point one evening when I found myself standing in the bedroom, staring at the half-packed suitcase sitting in the corner. I don't remember pulling it from the closet. I don't remember laying it open on the floor. But there it was, empty at first, then slowly filled with clothes I grabbed without thinking. A sweater, a pair of jeans, a few things I might need if I left for a few days. I wasn't packing to leave him for someone else. That thought never fully formed. I wasn't running toward anyone. I was running away from the confusion inside me. By the time the suitcase was zipped, my heart was pounding. I picked it up, set it by the door, and for a long moment, I just stood there, staring at it like it was a stranger in my own house. I didn't leave right away. I sat at the kitchen table, the suitcase beside me, my phone on the table, my hands curled loosely around a cold mug of tea. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second marking time I wasn't sure I had the courage to use. Eventually, I found myself at the train station. I couldn't even remember the walk there, but I was suddenly sitting on a metal bench, my suitcase by my side, the overhead announcements blurring into a steady drone. People moved around me, commuters with briefcases, teenagers with backpacks, an elderly couple holding hands, but they all felt far away, like I was invisible among them. I stared up at the board, the destinations flickering across the screen, city names, departure times, platform numbers. I imagined what it would feel like to pick one, to step onto a train, to leave behind everything I knew. My hand slipped into my coat pocket, feeling for my phone. It buzzed once, just a weather alert, nothing meaningful, and yet the vibration jolted me like a spark. I almost bought the ticket. I stood in front of the machine, my hand hovering over the screen, ready to tap out a destination. But then I stopped. I thought of my husband at home. I thought of the look on his face if he came home to an empty house, a missing suitcase, no note. I thought of the confusion, the betrayal, the pain. And then I thought of myself, of who I was before all of this, of who I wanted to be after it. I couldn't buy the ticket. I stepped back, my breath unsteady, my suitcase suddenly feeling heavier than before. I sat back down on the bench, watching as train after train came and went, their doors opening and closing like opportunities one couldn't take. By the time I finally stood again, the station was quieter. The sky outside had darkened, the streetlights humming softly in the dusk. I picked up my suitcase, my hand tightening on the handle, and walked out. I didn't leave. I went home. But I didn't feel like the same person who had left. The night I returned from the train station, the house felt both familiar and foreign all at once. I set the suitcase down by the door, the handle slipping from my grip, and for a long moment I just stood there, looking at it. It felt like the embodiment of all the choices I hadn't made, all the steps I hadn't taken. My husband was in the living room, reading in his chair, glasses low on his nose. He glanced up when he heard the door close. "You're back," he said simply, his voice calm, like nothing was unusual. "Yes," I answered, and the word felt strange in my mouth, heavy, almost guilty. He didn't ask where I'd gone or why I'd taken the suitcase. Maybe he assumed it was something harmless, maybe he didn't want to know, or maybe he knew more than I thought and chose silence over confrontation. Whatever the reason, I didn't explain. I just carried the suitcase to the bedroom and set it in the corner. The days that followed felt slower somehow, like I had stepped into a different rhythm. I moved through the house as if testing each step, as if relearning how to exist here. I made breakfast, I folded laundry, I paid bills, all the things I had always done, but now I was paying attention. For weeks, I hadn't been present. I had been moving, speaking, existing, but I hadn't been here. Not really. And now, back in the same walls, I found myself seeing everything again, the way the light fell across the kitchen in the late afternoon, the sound of the floor creaking in the hallway, the smell of my husband's coffee in the mornings. I thought about what I had done. Not in a single moment, but in the long chain of them, the first look, the first kiss, the trip to the pier, the night I couldn't take back. The guilt didn't fade, but it changed. It softened into something less jagged, something I could hold without cutting myself on it every time. It didn't erase what had happened, but it made it possible to breathe again. I didn't see him again. The young man who had come to fix the gate, the one who had been the spark for all of this, didn't return. Not to my door, not to my messages. And I didn't reach out. It wasn't a dramatic ending, just a quiet absence that grew until it became permanent. For a while, I wondered if he thought about me the way I thought about him in the quiet moments. But eventually, even that wondering faded into the background, like the hum of a forgotten appliance. What remained wasn't him. It was me. I began to do small things for myself again, not for anyone else, not because I was expected to, but because I wanted to. I bought a book I'd been meaning to read for years. I planted flowers in the garden, getting dirt under my fingernails in a way that felt good. I put music on in the kitchen and let it play while I cooked, even if no one was listening. My husband noticed the changes in me, but he didn't comment. Sometimes he would look at me across the table, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than they used to, as if he was seeing me differently. Maybe he sensed the shift, maybe he was just grateful for it. I didn't confess everything to him. Not in words. But in some way, he knew enough. And I knew enough too. The truth was, I hadn't left him. I hadn't stayed for him either. I had stayed for me. Because somewhere in all of this, in the mistakes, in the choices, in the nights I wish I could rewrite, I had found a piece of myself I thought I'd lost years ago. It wasn't neat. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind of story that ties itself into a perfect ending. But it was real. And as I sat by the window one morning, coffee in hand, the light spilling across the kitchen table, I realized that maybe that was enough. Enough to start again. Enough to keep living. Enough to finally feel like I had come home, not to this house, but to myself.